Like you think about kids in a school system. I mean, I grew up making all kinds of black jokes. And some of that you could say was to try and make myself feel more comfortable. But you could hear statements like, oh, the lights go out. And I'd be like, oh, can you see me? And everyone would laugh. But I often would say those things before someone else did. And it was this passive form of racism because then someone would follow up with like, well, like we don't actually not like black people, but it's just, the lights aren't on, so we can't see you.
Love God, love people, love people, love people. It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the AC Podcast. My name is Troy. I'm here today with the full team, Andy, Steve, and Wes. Guys, I can't remember the last time all four of us were on an episode.
It's the quad.
The quad.
It's been purposeful.
I can't remember the last time we were all together. It was probably something close to when we did our launch event. Might have been the last time. But it is exciting because coming up in just a couple of weeks, we will all be together in the same vicinity, under the same roof, because the Apologetics Canada Conference will be here March 1st and 2nd. And I'm really, really looking forward to it. I mean, we're probably going to have to take some kind of epic video again where, it's got rock and roll music. It's March, though, so I don't know if we're going to be in the Jeep, but we'll play that by ear. Yeah, the AC conference is right around the corner. I know we've been running around like, maybe not chickens with our heads cut off, but definitely chickens with a lot of work to do. And it's feeling exciting and frantic at the same time.
Yeah, and in fact, we got some great stuff coming up. We got the premiere of Can I Trust the Bible? We have been working on that. Wes, I think it's been like over a year of solid work on this thing. First prep to go to Egypt, film, and then get back from Egypt and just edit.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. If you include all of the planning going into actually taking the trip, then it's definitely been over a year.
You would think that being an insider, everybody will have already seen the edited version or whatever. But to tell you the truth, listeners, like I haven't seen anything other than the trailer. I haven't seen anything at all. So I'm actually really looking forward to the premiere that's happening at Columbia Bible College on February 29th on the Leap Day, no less. I don't know what that's got to do with
Steve in the dark.
Steve, that was a masterful segue into that promo. Like, you just did great, man.
Thank you.
It was so good.
I feel like he's a little bitter. He hasn't seen anything yet.
Steve can trust the Bible, but he can't trust his team because they're keeping him out of the know.
We'll deal with that stuff off screen, but, great job at the promo. But let's get into today's episode. Today we're having a conversation somewhat around the topic of passive racism. Now, Andy, I want to hand this over to you just because you presented this to the team and like kind of frame it for us, like where, to a certain degree, where did this kind of conversation come from? Like, obviously it's not one that's like necessarily a shocking conversation, but it definitely is one that I think definitely in recent times, maybe the heat's died down a little bit. We can have these kind of conversations safely.
Yeah. There's always the risk of talking on these subjects in that, one, it's like, okay, like everybody's like, oh man, are they trying to virtue signal or something like that? I hope it's clear that AC doesn't get caught up in the cultural nonsense. I hope that's clear. Yeah. And we seek to address issues that people are wrestling with and that they're asking us about. So lately we've been asked quite a bit about this topic of racism. And maybe that's because it's Black History Month. I don't know, but I don't think so. I think there's just issues that are still going on in our culture, and so we want to talk about. I do teach a class on theological anthropology, what it means to be human, and I've given a lot of thought to this concept of, or different ideas about racism historically that I think we need to think about, and of course biblically. And so on the podcast today, we want to talk about this subject from a biblical perspective and hopefully get people thinking in a Christian way about how do we navigate what's going on in culture and how do we actually seek to address the racism that's out there that's not necessarily, like you said, Troy, it's not necessarily always overt. Often it actually is more of this low-key kind of racism, as you called it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's racism when it comes to the church, and just I think any ministry conversation, it has to be handled with a gentleness and a grace, because quite honestly, you are risking polarizing people on both sides. And I've seen it, right, where you take a minority group that wants to have the conversation about racism and warranted, right? But it's very easy to paint a broad brush and then maybe even to try and put to rest any of our listeners who may be thinking, okay, well, why didn't AC say anything about Black History Month? Why didn't they, why was there no conversation about that? But if you would remember, 2 years ago, when I actually during Black History Month, I did 2 interviews with some Black leaders from different ministries, and I had some conversations about race and those conversations in the church. And one of the things that I just want to stress with people is, while there's nuance to the conversation, sometimes you're actually repeating the same conversation over and over and over and over, but you've just put different faces and maybe a different voice to it. And it's not saying that conversation is unnecessary. It is saying, though, that as people who have a platform, it's important for us to not get caught in a wheel of, oh, it's this season, so we're going to talk about this merely because it's this season, and do it in such a way that's messy. Like, for example, yes, it was Christmas, but we didn't talk merely about our favorite Christmas traditions. We took the angle of talking about Christ and his birth. So just to give context that there is wisdom involved in it. We are not passive in those areas of faith.
Yeah. So as we get into this, though, I mean, we've used the phrase low-key racism a lot, but just to be extra clear, what do we mean by that?
This may get defined differently for different people, but when you think of something in regards to passive racism, you could almost call it otherwise known as like almost internalized racism, where it's a person has a feeling of, a prejudice, or they have feelings towards other races that they wouldn't necessarily openly speak about, but the lens in which they look at life or a particular people group is through one of seeing, well, I see Black people like this, and so I'm only going to think of Black people like this. I'm only going to create spaces for Black people like this. Like, you can think of it in a lot of different ways, but the passive racism even can be something as simple as the kind of jokes you crack. Like you think about kids in a school system. I mean, I grew up making all kinds of Black jokes, and some of that you could say was to try and make myself feel more comfortable, but you could hear statements like, oh, the lights go out. And I'd be like, oh, can you see me? And everyone would laugh. But I often would say those things before someone else did. And it was this passive form of racism, because then someone would follow up with like, well, we don't actually not like Black people, but it's just, the lights aren't on, so we can't see you. And it's like, that's actually not okay. Like, it's actually, it's actually offensive, right? Because you're pointing out a difference in color and using it as something to essentially make fun of me. That's kind of how I'd explain it.
I want to jump in on that a little deeper, just to give like a definition of racism. We're talking about discrimination and prejudice against people based on their race or ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And as you're pointing out, Troy, this tends to come up in different ways. And that was a significant conversation you and I had once, where you told me about a situation with the lights going off and somebody cracking a joke saying something to the effect of, oh, you won't see Troy until he smiles, sort of thing, or something like that. And I remember, you were telling me, you're like, man, it was actually really hurtful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And because it's something that you're just, you kind of understand the reality of it. Like, this is my complexion, so that's just kind of the way it goes. But using it as a tool of jest, quite honestly, and I maybe I'm one of the only ones that might say this, but even within the community, it's something that walks a very fine line, and you have to, I know this can be a buzzword for a lot of people, but there is some racial trauma that people have actually just carried forward that they use it almost as a defense mechanism. So much like I'm saying, you may hear a person crack those jokes, but really deep down, they don't want to. They just want to they want to say it first before someone else does, right? If you've seen 8 Mile, Eminem makes fun of him growing up in a trailer park before the guy he's battle rapping against can use it against him. And it actually unarmed that other artist, and he couldn't say anything against them. But it's still like, oh, I actually don't like these things, but I'd rather say it about myself than you do.
Alongside that, I think that was a helpful definition, Andy. Kind of piggybacking off of that, theologically, I would argue that racism as a sin, because that's what it is, it's a sin, is the sin of partiality. And this is what you see talked about in James, specifically chapter 2, where it reflects judging or showing favoritism based on external appearances. Mm-hmm. And so when we're talking about racism, we're talking about those physiological phenotypes that express, whether that's the color of your skin or even, I think, certain characteristics that differentiate how we look, whether we're from one part of the world or another. And so that's why I think this is an important topic, because it is a sin issue, and it's not limited to one group or the other. If it's sin, it's a human condition.
Yep.
And if it's a human condition, then we're all susceptible to committing it against our brothers and sisters and ultimately against God.
Can I give you a bit of a pushback, though? Not necessarily a pushback, but again, I'm looking for clarity, because the sin of partiality in James, I'm glad you mentioned that it was based on external appearances, because in James, he talks about how people who appear to be wealthy, they are favored, right? They're shown favor. And that partiality can be, well, doesn't have to be wealth. It can be skin tone. It can be some other external trait. And I say I'm glad you brought up external appearances, but because I think there are certain partialities that are appropriate. For example, like we all have children, and we are partial to our children in a way that we're not to other children, right? And so I think, there are proper forms of partiality there. So partiality per se is not the issue, but it's the kind of partiality that it is, in this case, based on external appearances alone.
Well, and specifically the sin of partiality. So not partiality in and of itself, but the sin. Right. In the same way that discrimination can be a wrong thing, but we discriminate all the time, in the sense that I discriminate properly when I make decisions to do one thing or the other. It doesn't necessarily default to discrimination being a bad decision, although we would often use that word within a situation where it would be negative discrimination. I think prefacing the word partiality with the word sin is important, because, like you point out, Steve, not all partiality is necessarily wrong, but when partiality becomes sinful, it's when we're judging someone on the base of an outward appearance, where it's an unjust ruling against that person and treating them differently because of that thing.
Agreed.
I want to go further down that rabbit trail, but before we do, I got to juxtapose really quickly here Troy and Steve, because we were just talking about joking, and we need to be careful about how we joke with each other. And this is something that I had to work through, by the way, even because people love poking fun at a bald man. And I like had to learn to just embrace that. Yeah, Steve's on board with that. I had to learn how to embrace it, because there is just this weird thing that humans like to do, where we like to point out our differences for whatever reason, and instead of pointing out our, what unites us, we'll often want to point out what's separating us, and I don't know if it's insecurities or why we tend to do that, but I do find it fascinating that Steve, on the other hand, loves Asian jokes. And since the day we began working together, he hasn't stopped cracking Asian jokes. Now, I've sometimes I'm like, I'm not even sure if I should laugh at that, Steve. But but I am curious. What's up with that? Like, on the one hand, jokes can be quite hurtful, but on the other hand, like Steve, you find them very funny.
Yeah, I do find them very funny. I wasn't always like that, though, because when I first came to Canada and, there's sort of the soft form of racism that you experience between groups, even within Asian groups, right? Oh, there are the Koreans over there, there are the Cantonese over there, those guys are from Taiwan. And, some people might not even be able to tell us apart, but we are cracking jokes at each other. And I do remember feeling quite offended whenever, say, my friends who happen to be of Indian descent would make fun of me based on the way I looked. And at some point, I realized that a lot of people were walking on eggshells around me on the basis of racism. So when I crack those jokes, I do it actually very intentionally just for me. Like, I can't speak for everybody else, but the reason I do that is because when I do that first, it puts everybody else at ease, right? So in a sense, for me, it's a gift to them. Hey, listen, you don't have to walk on eggshells around me. And along with that, part of it was just my recognition, just for myself, again, I can't speak for everybody else, that when I was feeling offended, I didn't have to let it offend me. And so then when I let go of it, it was quite liberating, actually, because I didn't have to deal with every negative emotion they came with whenever somebody said something. So I was set free from my own sort of, hey, I'm going to feel offended by this. So there was that side of me. At the same time, I understand that, again, I keep saying that this is for myself because I can't speak for everybody else because people have different histories based on this. And my experience and Troy's experience, for example, probably have been quite different growing up, so on and so forth. And so that's where I'm coming from.
I think it's interesting. This is insightful for me, because I'm finding that there's actually a huge similarity between you with regards to the jokes, that you would want to do it first to. Yeah, that's really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
What would be your guy? If we could just say something about this, Kay, what kind of wisdom could we impart to people that have a friend that they're wondering how to be a friend to?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think we underestimate the value of relationships sometimes. Like, there's a lot to learn from a person just by actually not just hearing about where they're from, but how does where they're from dictate where they are now? And for giving you a prime example is, like, I'm Jamaican. For many, many years, I struggled because I wasn't Jamaican enough for the Jamaicans, but I wasn't Canadian enough for the Canadians. And so my life in particular, and I'll say this to people, this is why we did something like branded Rethinking Identity. I had an identity crisis for much of my life. It wasn't until, I started getting older and I'd go to the States where people weren't staring at me. Growing up in Saskatchewan, man, there was not a lot of black kids, let alone black families, who weren't of African descent, right? There was a whole area around where I grew up where many of the immigrant African families all lived in these apartment complexes in those areas, right? Families were sponsoring families and they're all in the same area. So for me to grow up adjacent to that, but not in that, they were like, oh, okay, you're black and Canadian, but you're Jamaican. How does that work? And so this identity crisis was constantly spinning for me. And then I'm receiving racism as I'm growing up. And then I'm receiving prejudice as I'm growing up. Then as I got older, I realized how much of that is just cultural, that much of that was cultural ignorance as well, right? I will say that I think there's far more cultural ignorance than there is racism in a lot of settings if you really spend the time to pay attention to it. But that's maybe that's for another day. But the challenge I found, especially when we're talking about the jokes, was the reason I couldn't handle the jokes is because I actually didn't know where I stood. I didn't know. I'm like, well, I'm not black enough, but now you're attacking my blackness. Or, oh, Troy, you sound white. Well, I'm like, I'm not white. And I get told that every day. So there's this like edge to me that was like, so don't like just shut your mouth because I'm trying to figure this out, right? And it was a very tense thing, and I can't say I always handled it well. Sometimes I looked at things through the lens of oh, they don't like me because I'm black. It's like, well, no, maybe your character sucked in that season. Maybe you're just not the person for the job. But what I have realized, and this is why I can't speak for Steve, but that common denominator is it's a defense mechanism, right? Steve recognized, okay, this is how this makes me feel. If I flip it, then they no longer have that power over me. But one thing that I have when I have conversations with people, it's like you're still recognizing though that there is a power balance. You are feeling the need to put everyone else at ease. And I ask the question, it's like, why do I have to put everyone else at ease? If I just let you in and we have a conversation in a relationship, can I be at ease as well? Can't we talk about each other's differences without making those the butt of the joke? Like, I think there's so many other funny things in the world, but it's easy. And I've been guilty of this, right? I've made bald jokes. And some people may say, and Andy, you may laugh it off, right? Like, some people may laugh it off, but but when you really think about it, you don't necessarily know where the root of that person's bald joke is from. That guy's insecure, so he's going to point out that about Andy because he's actually intimidated by Andy, or, and same thing, Wes goes to the gym. Person who doesn't go to the gym may say, oh, Wes is just a gym rat, right? It's often rooted in some form of insecurity, or it can be.
I'm sorry, Troy. I can't let the root of a bald joke go. That's the moment you said it, I was like, not follicle roots, but
wow.
You know what? This is an interesting conversation because I find maybe part of this and the intricacy of it and the nuance of the conversation is a testament to the fact that we live in a broken world. Because in one sense, race, unlike gender, actually exists on a continuum in a way that other things don't, right? Like both you, Steve, and you, Troy, your kids are mixed. And in that sense, there's a spectrum as to how your kids are both perceived and understand themselves, and even their ethnic kind of identity there. Because unlike being male or female, realistically, the four of us are more genetically similar as human beings and as males than we are different. Than say like versus myself and my wife. We're very genetically different. But there's this complexity to the issue of race where we actually have more in common genetically than we don't. But there are these kind of superficial external traits that do have, impacts. There are, because of where our ancestors have come from and because the amount of sunlight or the amount of kind of geographical hardship, whatever, we do have differences. But living in a place like Canada, which is very multicultural, you see the differences when there are so many mixed couples and there are mixed kids. How do those children identify? How do they understand themselves? I think there's this conversation kind of gets messy because of the fact that race exists on a continuum.
Yeah. That's a great point, because I think about that sometimes when I look at my kids, right? Because they're half Korean and half, European. And so when I look at them, I think to myself, okay, how am I going to raise them in such a way that they appreciate who they are? And in doing that, I really have to kind of look back on my struggles. I really resonated with what you were saying, Troy, about not being black enough and not being white enough. I've had much the same reaction. I think that's common to people who immigrate at a young age or are adopted from elsewhere, where you feel torn between two worlds, right? So when I first came to Canada, there was no doubt, I'm a Korean living in Canada, right? And that went on long enough. At some point, I said, you know what? I don't really feel all that Korean. And other people who had recently come from Korea would point out things about, how Western I was in some ways, right? So at some point, I kind of had to let go of this tension between, okay, I have to be either Korean or Canadian. But why can't I just accept who I am right now, which is
Yeah.
A Korean who immigrated when he was 14 and has now lived in Canada long enough that he is, well, that's exactly what I am. I am a Canadian with a Korean background who's lived in Canada for a long time. And I kind of, I know it's very specific, but I settled into that specificity. And then I felt this release, right? Because I didn't have to try to be either Korean or white or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, and as I'm saying that too, I think of you, Andy, because I mean, interestingly enough, none of us were really born in Canada here.
Right.
And you too, Andy, you, I mean, it's Canada, right? We borrow everything from America, including the head of Apologetics Canada, who is not actually, was not born Canadian.
He's Canadian now.
He is.
I do have Canadian citizenship, which is funny though, because my mom, when I became a Canadian citizen, my mom was like, you know, do you still have your American citizenship? I'm like, yeah, Mom. Don't worry. I'm, seriously though, for an American, like there's identity to being American.
Yeah.
But for me,
yeah.
But like you, Steve, I've lived in Canada longer than I've lived in the United States, and so I very much have a Canadian identity, and not so much of an American identity, and in that regard.
I think there is something to be said about diversity in the sense of, I know diversity in some circles can be a bit of a dirty word these days because of all the political baggage that comes with it, but in the Bible, diversity is clearly celebrated. Like I think right now in our small group that we host, we're going through the book of Revelation, right? And you hear about the 144,000, but then John turns and looks and he sees people from all tribes, language, right? There is a diverse group. Yeah, tongue and nations, and they're all there together worshiping the Lord. So on the one hand, there is diversity, but on the other hand, there is unity, right? In fact, the concept of unity doesn't make any sense unless you presuppose diversity, because the opposite of unity is not diversity. I think opposite of unity is uniformity, just having one form, right? So I think this is really important. Biblically speaking, there is diversity among people, but they're united under one Lord.
So what I hear you saying is then we can celebrate that there's differences between us, but that we also are united as one family. This is often a picture you see in the Bible, such that I'm not the same as my brothers and sisters. We're not identical, but that's something to be celebrated, not to
The key thing is there is something that transcends our differences, right? Yes, there are differences, but so for me, biblically speaking, what I see is, yes, I'm an Asian. Yes, Troy is a Jamaican descent, whatever. But what's more important is that Troy, me, you, and Wes, all of us are brothers. We all come from different backgrounds, but we're brothers in Christ. That's what unites us. And that's the most important thing. And I'm not going to let race get in the way of me working with you, I'm not, I remember when Wes came to us, we were exploring the possibility of Wes joining us on the team. And I just kind of jokingly said, well, here's one precondition. You have to shave your head, to join the club, kind of a thing. Yes, it was a joke. But there's something more important than baldness, which is the fact that Wes is a brother of mine, and I love him, and I would love to work with him.
I'm glad it's not just my hair follicle or the lack of it that allowed me on the team.
Passive racism.
One of the verses that's always stuck out to me is in Ephesians. Paul in chapter 2 talks a lot about the wall of hostility that separates us, particularly that separated the Jews from the Gentiles. And in fact, this goes back to the point you were making, Troy, about Samaritans. They were referred to as half-breeds, and that's how they were understood.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of animosity we don't have time to get in the history of that with regards to the Samaritans. But there was animosity of all sorts with, various groups of people. Again, I don't want to belabor this, but these people look the same. There's always reasons for us to divide from one another. Like we're not in need of reasons for division. We'll come up with all, sorts of reasons to divide. The question is what's ultimately going to unite us? And that's a significant question that we have to deal with. In Ephesians chapter 2, I love what Paul says in verse 19 and on. He says, consequently, you're no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. And he goes on, of course, in Galatians, he says, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all one in Christ. I mean, that is radical kind of thinking here, that we in fact are one. And one of the ways that he puts that actually is that before this, he says in verse 15, that's again quite significant, by setting aside in his flesh the law, which with its commands and regulations, his purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. This idea that we are one in Christ. Now, Of course, in the 18th century, you get that completely, blown up. This idea that we're one with regards to a scientific justification for what I would argue has always been there. So the idea of racism of some kind or another and dividing against each other for all sorts of reasons, don't get me wrong, that has always been there. This is, as Wes said, this is a sin issue.
Yep.
But it takes on a particularly unique perspective when it becomes scientifically justified, I would argue. And I don't know if you guys would, how you would, if maybe you disagree with me here, but the scientific justification for it, I think, just put fuel on the fire of colonizing,
absolutely,
and slavery and division throughout the world.
Well, and on top of that, you have Paul talking in Colossians chapter 3, right, where he says, similar to what you were saying before, but he kind of broadens it where he says in Christ there's no Greek and Jew. So he's talking broadly in terms of religious, but also kind of an ethno-religious perspective, circumcised and uncircumcised, once again. But then he mentions barbarians and Scythians. So there he really is targeting ethnicities, whereas the barbarians were from Europe. The Scythians were what would be an Asian, from Asian descent, Mongolian, and then slave-free, that all are in Christ. And so he's going through the gamut of what are understood, right? And then in Galatians, the passage that you quoted, Andy, he's talking about male and female as well. So this kind of unity that we find, it transcends all of these ways that we would differentiate ourselves and put ourselves in different types of boxes, that we're all one, even though the sort of unity doesn't look like uniformity, but we are unified in Christ, and all of these differences fade away.
Yeah, it reminds me of, Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman, right? There's so many complexities to that conversation, right? You can go into time of day. You can go to the fact that Jesus was having a conversation with them. You can go with her to begin with, under the cover of night, away from the disciples, right? There's so many different conversations that can come up there. But when you're looking at John 4, you could start at 19, where she responds to Jesus after, initially getting this, where he's read her mail, essentially, like, you got a whole bunch of husbands. She's like, oh, okay. It says, I see you are a prophet, sir, the woman said. My Samaritan ancestors worship God on this mountain, but you Jews say that that Jerusalem is the place where we should worship God. Jesus said to her, believe me, woman, the time will come when people will not worship the Father either on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans do not really know whom you worship, but we Jews know whom we worship, because it is from the Jews that salvation comes. But the time is coming and is already here when by the power of God's Spirit, people will worship the Father as he really is, offering him the true worship that he wants. God is Spirit, and only by the power of his Spirit can people worship him as he really is. And speaking to what we're saying is like what what unites us is the Spirit of God. That is the only thing that will truly unite us. And so it goes to ask the question, maybe, for in a world where everyone wants to be the next social justice hero, which I think is great in and of itself, but especially as a believer, you just fighting for racial equality or racial equity, quite honestly, you may, and not saying you're not going to be impactful, you're going to symbolize the kingdom, but at the same time, for what? It's ultimately so people can come to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Like we've been called to the ministry of reconciliation for the sake of reconciling people to Christ, not trying to just unite humanity. Because if you try and unite humanity, eventually we're going to go right back in that wheel. The only thing that is going to truly pull us together is Christ, because otherwise, what would we need him for? If we could just figure it out, what would we need him for? You see that in Babel. You see God sends them all over the place because they were united in just themselves, and all of their desires were based on what they wanted, and they had created gods in their own image, which means to me that there's a lot of power in unity, and it's very dangerous when misplaced.
Let me throw out a conversation piece here that I've been hearing more about. This is something that I was like unfamiliar with, and I find this interesting how there's different types of division that happens even within groups of people that I find interesting, because oftentimes people might say, oh, that division is between, one group against another group. But even when you have within a group, so for example, I have a friend that's originally from Africa. And when he came to North America, it was kind of like what you had said, Troy, like wasn't black enough sort of thing, because he might be black, but he didn't have a slave tradition. Mm-hmm. He wasn't a part of, that history. And so then he was classified in a certain kind of way. My time in Asia, man, the amount of racism that I saw in Asia, particularly actually around skin color, was quite significant. From what I understand, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but it developed out of, and I don't know how far back this goes, but it developed out of hard labor, that those who worked in the sun had darker skin and those who didn't had lighter skin. And so when you go to Asia today, it's quite common when you go into a grocery store to see skin lightening.
That's big in the Filipino community, for sure.
Yeah.
Which tends to speak to actually more of class than it does about some sort of race, or the skin color actually is pointing to your class within the society. Mm-hmm. So,
and there's an inversion of that in our culture, right? Like, say, go to somewhere in California, if you have sort of tan skin tone, right, that is a symbol of you have the leisure to go to the beach and get tanned and all those kinds of things. And if you're too, to put it crassly, too pasty white, then that says something about, your value as a person or something like that. So it has more to do with wealth and status and class, I think.
That's a good point.
My point in bringing that up is it's again, I'm kind of just wanting to blow it up a little bit. Again, just saying that this is actually more complicated than people want to make it out to be. Mm-hmm. Not to be crass, but they want to try to make it black and white. But it's every shade in between. Yeah. And that this sort of divisions going on within groups, and that this is a sin problem that permeates our world. And that I think as Christians, we have to think about at some level, how are these different ways that we are being divided? And not that we want to get hung up on the division, but asking how do we remain united? How do we seek unity in the family of God and not get caught up with literally just a plethora of different ways that culture wants to segregate us and divide us from one another?
Yeah. I think it's a really fine line between, or at least in our cultural imaginary, between difference and division.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes we tend to think that difference necessarily implies division of some sort. And I don't think it has to be that way.
Like, and not for the sake of merely self-promotion, but this is one of the reasons why our church at the end of March is doing a conference called Multi. And that conference is talking about, the power of diversity. But what we're doing is it's not merely one where it's just, let's just talk about race. No, let's talk about the different angles of even people in ministry, right? Like we have a bunch of different speakers, like very intentionally we're having different speakers from our community as well that are going to speak from these different topics. Yeah, we're going to talk about race, but then we're, talking about gender roles in the church, talking about what it's like to be a single person and pursue wholeness, what it's like to be a married person and pursue a covenant relationship, right? I think when we think of diversity, we have to think of it as more than just race and gender. And I think that's what we were kind of saying at the beginning, is when we kind of let the world and let culture dictate what diversity is, you only look at it from those two points of view. And it's gender and skin color. But there's so much more in there, right? I mean, we're just finished talking about classism, and you want to start talking about that. Man, there's way more people. I think if they had the conversation about class, there'd be way more people that may not have ever had a conversation that'd be able to relate. You want to start talking about economic status in Canada right now and how many people are feeling the weight of, a recession, inflation, and everything in between. You're going to watch as like, we're actually not as far apart as I thought. And even though we only talked about race, I realize we're both struggling. And this is very real. How do we move forward? I didn't even realize. What was it like for you when you came from your country with a doctorate and now you're having to, no shade to someone working at Tim's, but you were a doctor in India and now you're having to work at Tim Hortons as a cashier because you can't get a job. Like, where does that come from? Is that a race thing? Is that a class thing? And I just think that we oftentimes oversimplify these conversations. And so I don't think it's an exhausted conversation. I think the point that Andy is getting at, like listeners, is just for us to just say, it's over now. We've solved it. It's not the point. But there is a heading for the believer. And I hope that's what you're getting out of this. There is a heading for the believer that points to Christ. And there's going to be tension. But God is also in the midst of that tension. He does promise. This is one of the promises of life with him, is that this struggle will pass away when we're with him in glory. And thank God, because when we get in glory, the diversity is going to be there, but we're actually, probably won't even care as it should have been.
Let me just say something that I just kind of learned from this, and I'm curious your thoughts, Steve, is I'm learning that when somebody's joking, that there's a lot more going on that I needed to be aware of.
Yeah.
And I think that as Christians, we need to be cautious of that. Just because you have a friend that's maybe Black, Asian, or whatever, and they're making a joke about their ethnicity, and then you might think, this is great because I got this really great joke that I've been just dying to say, or something. It's like, maybe you shouldn't, and maybe you should realize that there's more going on there, and that we have to think through how do we work together to be unified and not making fun of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, you asked, what word of advice might we have? As for passive racism, when we, make these jokes and whatnot, I tend to think, again, I'm just speaking for myself, I tend to think we're making too much of it. As it feels to me as if we're giving racism too much power in calling it even passive racism, because you're assuming racism from the get-go and you're kind of bringing racism into this. Now, this is a kind of a thought in development for me, so it's not like, don't take it as gospel truth or anything like that. But I try to err on the side of making too little of racism because I see around me, just through my perspective, it seems like our culture is feeding more and more into racism. So it's a reaction, right? That's what I'm doing. But again, that's just for myself. I can't speak for anybody else, but that's what goes through my mind.
No, I can agree. I can definitely agree. I think it's much like, I don't know, growing up and you hear the phrase finding the devil behind every bush, right? There's this constant concern of like, oh, don't watch Harry Potter, don't play Pokemon cards, because it's the devil, the spiritual things, right? And it's much like how you were taught. It's like, okay, well, the spiritual is real. It is real, and you do need to be mindful of the spiritual things. And it's much like racism. Racism is real, but you will absolutely drive yourself crazy looking for racism in every single setting. You'll never find any peace. Like, we said this before, is maybe you didn't get the job because you weren't cut out for the job. Or maybe that person was racist. But I, for one, have no desire to figure out every single person I've crossed in this life that didn't give me the job, didn't give me the opportunity, was racist. Like, I'd prefer my peace. I really, really would. I will say that I have many interactions with people. Like, for example, I lived in Manitoba, and shout out all the Mennonites on this listening to the podcast. I lived in Manitoba. I was around people that were straight up from Paraguay, were from Germany, were from Dutch background. I was the first black person they'd got to sit and have a conversation longer than an hour with, who they could ask me about my hair texture. They could ask me about where I grew up. They could ask me about my skin color. Because up to that point, they're seeing me at a distance. They're seeing me from afar. And so much of those conversations was me helping them work through their cultural ignorance. Them saying, hey, Troy, why do you don't seem to talk like this or act like this, but why do I see so many rappers that act like this and do this and that? Well, me explaining to them where those people grew up, me explaining to them the cultural references, explaining to them the style and clothing. It gave them a grander worldview. And I think where we like to yell racism, I think it's just a smaller worldview, right? Andy, like, you've traveled all over the place. You could probably attest to learning so much about these different cultures that, wow, okay, the way I saw this on TV was completely wrong, right? I mean, finding out Wes grew up in the Middle East, he has a very unique understanding of Middle Eastern culture that the average white Canadian is not going to have. But now he can speak to those areas when it comes to faith and religion that other people aren't going to get. Well, thank you, listeners, so much for listening to the AC Podcast. We are a ministry, and so make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube and all of your favorite streaming platforms. Make sure you follow our events page at apologeticscanada.com/events. We got a lot coming up, and we want you to be there. We want to interact with you, and we love to hang out with you coming up at the Can I Trust the Bible premiere, as well as the AC conference at the beginning of March. But you know the drill, you know the motto. Until next time, love God, love people. Bye for now.
It's the AC Podcast. For the love of God, love people.